It all began with something that, at first glance, seemed like just another ordinary historical record. Old photographs of public inaugurations, crowds gathered in squares, local authorities lined up for a solemn ceremony, cloths being removed from newly installed sculptures, bronze, stone, marble, imposing monuments, clearly expensive works, planned, approved by commissions, financed with public funds. Nothing out of the ordinary, until the moment you read the plaque. There is no name. The inscription doesn't say who was honored. There's no date of birth, no lineage, no brief biography, just a generic title: the architect, the academic, the engineer, the doctor, as if the identity had been purposefully removed and replaced by a function, as if the person had been transformed into a category. And this is not an isolated case. When you start cross-referencing photographic archives, municipal records, and 19th-century monument catalogs, a pattern begins to emerge. Official ceremonies, recognized sculptures, documented expenses, but the honoree remains anonymous. Not unknown, anonymous. There is an important difference between the two. An unknown person is someone whose identity we don't know. An anonymous person is someone whose name is not being mentioned. And here arises the first tension. Why would a city invest so much money to erect a public statue and not register the name of the person being honored? Public monuments don't work that way. Historically, the primary function of a monument is to preserve nominal memory. Generals have names, scientists have names, patrons have names. Even controversial figures retain identification. The plaque is an essential part of the monument. It anchors the work in history. Remove the name, and you remove traceability. But in these sculptures, what should be the most important element has been replaced by a generic label. The more examples that appear, the harder it becomes to treat this as chance or artistic exception. We're not talking about classical allegories, those female figures symbolizing justice, freedom, or commerce. These follow their own style: timeless garments, theatrical poses, idealized features. But these nameless sculptures are different. They have specific faces, historically identifiable costumes, detailed technical tools, precise instruments of work. They don't look like ideas, they look like portraits. This changes everything. Sculptural portraits typically require direct reference, model, drawings, facial studies, approval. Portraits imply an individual, so why portray the individual and remove the name? Some records show that the inauguration ceremonies did indeed take place. There are printed programs, announcements in local newspapers, descriptions of public speeches. But when you look for the central point, who was honored, you find documentary silence. The event is recorded, the sculpture is recorded, the cost is recorded. The honoree is not. It's as if the main part has been erased, leaving everything else intact. And the most unsettling detail is that in some cases, the current inscription seems to have come after the monument. Different typography, replaced plaques, vague rededications, generic expressions where there were probably proper names before. This raises a delicate but inevitable hypothesis. What if some of these statues were not born anonymous and were renamed later? If this is true, then we are not simply dealing with nameless statues. We are dealing with identities that have been removed. And when you realize this, the question ceases to be aesthetic and becomes historical. Who were these people? What did they do? Why were they publicly honored and then de-identified? Who decides that a memory can remain, but the name cannot? Public tributes exist to preserve names. Here, the opposite happens, and it is precisely in this inversion that the mystery begins. At first, the mind tries to protect logic. You look at a nameless statue and think it must be a rare case, a local whim, an aesthetic choice. Maybe the original plaque was lost. Maybe it's an allegory. Maybe nobody cared enough to record its identity. And that's it. The brain closes the account and moves on. But the problem is that it doesn't stay in one place. When you start comparing files from different cities, what seemed like an exception becomes a repetition. And when the repetition crosses borders, languages, political regimes, and continents, it ceases to be a strange coincidence and becomes something much more serious, a pattern. And that's where the subject takes a different turn, because the same structure appears in places that, in theory, had no reason to be doing the same thing at the same time. Squares in provincial towns, regional capitals, port centers, university cities, municipalities that don't appear in major history books but which share one detail in common. At some point between the mid and late 19th century, they erected expensive public monuments with formal ceremonies, competent sculptures, and generic titles replacing identities. The architect, the academic, the engineer, the doctor. And the more you find, the harder it becomes to say that all of this happened spontaneously and in isolation. The pattern begins to seem almost formatted, as if there was a ready-made mental model. Build the statue, represent an individual with specific traits, then attach a generic plaque that prevents any biographical investigation. The question then evolves, why does this pattern repeat so often? And it's not just the title. In several cases, what stands out is the history of inscriptions. There are typical signs of replacement, plaques with screws newer than the pedestal, typography different from the period of the monument, material incompatible with the rest of the work, an old bronze supporting a plaque that seems too recent. In other cases, old newspaper accounts mention inaugurations and speeches, but the descriptions don't match what is written today, as if the narrative had been re-edited. And this is where incomplete records come in, which are almost more revealing than complete ones. Because 19th century cities were bureaucratic to an absurd degree. There are records on street lighting, street vending, neighbor disputes, sidewalk repairs. Everything was documented. So when you find holes precisely in what should be the core of the monumental decision, who was honored, why, with what biography, it doesn't seem like an accident. It seems like a selective editing. You can find the sculptor's contract, you'll find the approved budget, you can find the date of the ceremony, you can find the guest list, but the name disappears, the justification disappears. The mail disappears. The minutes of the meeting disappear. With each new example, it becomes more difficult to sustain the traditional explanation that it's just symbolism. If it were symbolism, there would be more variation. Each city would choose different symbols. Each place would have its own style. But what emerges is almost a standardization of human categories, as if someone were saying, preserve the function, erase the person. And when you expand to multiple countries, things get even more uncomfortable. Because even with different cultures, with different names and traditions, the mechanics seem the same. The same logic of anonymous by title, the same absence of biography, the same difficulty in tracing identities, the same feeling that it was made to exist publicly but to be impossible to investigate in depth. This is important. It's not invisible. It's in the square. It's in the center. It's in the most obvious place possible. But it's silent. And silence is a tool. Another recurring element is rededication. Instead of demolishing the statue, some places seem to have done something more efficient. Reassign it, retell it, change the plaque, change the object in the hand, reinterpret the same sculpture as if it had always been that way. When this happens, the monument becomes a palimpsest. On the outside, official history. On the inside, vestiges of what was removed. And it is at this moment that the script needs to heighten the tension with a simple observation. If it were merely a coincidence, the pattern would be irregular. But he is consistent. If it were only art, there would be freedom, but there is repetition. If it were simply forgetfulness, there would be randomness, but there is synchronization in specific decades. And when there is repetition on a global scale, what you are seeing is not a series of accidents, you are seeing a process. Repeated patterns indicate a process, not a coincidence. If a renaming process exists, then someone was interested in a very specific outcome, preserving the presence of these figures in the public sphere, but severing the thread that links these figures to real names, genealogies, documents, attributable works, and a searchable history. And this is where the research changes phase. Because from this point on, the question is no longer, why doesn't a statue have a name? The question becomes, why have so many, in so many places, undergone the same transformation? Topic 3. Details that don't match with allegorical statues. When the subject of nameless statues is raised, the official explanation usually comes quickly and comfortably. They are allegories, symbolic representations of professions, virtues, or ideals. The architect as a symbol of construction, the scholar as a symbol of knowledge, the engineer as a symbol of technical progress. At first glance, this seems to solve the mystery effortlessly. The history of art is indeed full of allegorical figures, but the problem begins when you look closely, technically, not superficially, at the details of these sculptures. Because the details don't behave like allegory. Classical allegory follows relatively stable visual rules. It tends towards timelessness. The figures wear stylized clothing, often inspired by Greco-Roman antiquity, regardless of the work's date. The poses are theatrical. The faces are idealized. The intention is not to portray a specific person, but to communicate a broad idea. Justice has no individual wrinkles. Liberty has no scar on its eyebrow. Commerce has no single psychological expression. Allegories are visual archetypes. Now compare that to many of these renamed statues. What appears in them is not timelessness, it's historical precision in clothing. Coats with cuts identifiable by decade, buttons positioned according to specific fashion trends, types of collars that clothing historians can date with a relatively narrow margin, fabric folds that follow tailoring patterns from defined periods, hats, boots, belts, and accessories that don't belong to the symbolic universe, they belong to the real wardrobe of a real era. Allegories don't follow dated trends. Portraits do. And it doesn't stop there. The tools depicted also raise problems for allegorical explanation. In traditional allegories, the objects are simple and recognizable symbols: scales for justice, a book for knowledge, a sword for power, a branch for peace. They are generic because they need to communicate quickly. In these sculptures, however, the instruments are often technically specific: compasses of a particular model, drawing boards with structural markings, measuring equipment with detailed configuration, navigation or surveying devices that specialists can classify by period of use. This is professional language, not symbolic language. A symbol works when it's simplified. A technical tool only makes sense when it's precise. And visual precision usually indicates direct reference, observation of something real, use by a real person. Another critical point is facial features. Allegories tend toward facial generalization, harmonious proportions, ideal symmetry, neutral or elevated expression. It's the concept face. But in many of these unnamed sculptures, the opposite appears: individuality, slight asymmetry, age lines, specific bone structure, restrained, non-theatrical expressions. In some cases, features so particular that they seem to have been copied from a live model or a pre-existing portrait. Sculptors know the difference between human type and human individual. Portraying an individual takes more work. It requires study. It requires intention. No one invests hours in fine anatomical modeling to represent only a generic abstraction unless there is a reason for fidelity. And this creates a direct conflict with the narrative of pure allegory. If it were merely a symbol of a profession, there would be no need for so much individualization. A reusable standard model would suffice. But what we see is consistent facial variation among sculptures that received the same generic title. Several different architects with different faces, different ages, different features, all officially treated as if they were just the same abstract concept. Concepts don't age. People do. There is also the question of body posture. Allegories often assume open, almost performative poses designed for symbolic interpretation from a distance. Many of these monuments, on the other hand, present restrained, functional, natural postures, someone holding instruments as if they were actually using them, not as if they were symbolically displaying them. The body seems posed for a portrait, not for theater. When you bring these elements together, historically accurate clothing, technically specific tools, individualized faces, natural posture, the result points in a direction that is hard to ignore. The language of historical portraiture, not classical allegory. This doesn't automatically prove that each statue represents an identifiable person, but it significantly weakens the explanation that they are all merely generic symbols. An alternative hypothesis is gaining traction. These sculptures may have been conceived as portraits of real individuals and only later given generic labels that erased their identities. It's as if the name has been removed, but the face has remained. And this creates a silent tension in the work, because you are looking at someone, but officially that someone is nobody, just a function. Just a title, just a professional category transformed into stone and bronze. The crucial internal hook here is that allegories don't use precise historical fashion. Allegories don't need anatomical identity. Allegories don't carry technical tools configured with operational precision. When a sculpture does all of that, it comes much closer to a portrait, and portraits, by definition, should have names. When the name isn't there, the absence ceases to be a detail. It becomes evidence that something was cut from visible history, but not completely erased from physical form. The image remains, the identification disappears. And this fracture between form and name is precisely where the mystery deepens. Topic 4. Missing documents and subsequent alterations. When you enter 19th century municipal archives expecting to find answers about these monuments, you expect abundance, not emptiness. The bureaucracy of that time was meticulous. Cities recorded practically everything: market permits, small fines, property disputes, street repairs, the purchase of street lights. The administrative machine functioned on paper, and it functioned excessively. Therefore, what is striking is not when there are many, it's when precisely at the most important point they are not there. The pattern begins to repeat itself in an uncomfortably bad way. You can find the sculptor's contract, you can find the amount paid, you can find the supplier of the bronze or the stone, you can find the construction schedule here, but you fail to find the central justification: who exactly was being honored and why. The minutes from the committee that should have recorded the decision to erect the monument are missing, incomplete, or marked as lost. Correspondence that would normally accompany a public project of this size simply doesn't appear. It's as if the documentary periphery survived, but the explanatory core was removed. Archives have flaws, of course. Fires, floods, building changes, poor cataloging. It happens. But what transforms the flaw into a pattern is selectivity. because the gaps don't appear randomly distributed. They are always concentrated in the same type of information: identity, biography, motivation for the tribute. It's not the cost that disappears. It's not the contract. It's not the logistics. It's the name. Another element that emerges in fragmented records are short, cold mentions of subsequent removals. Dry lines in minutes from the early 20th century with phrases such as "monument removed by directive," "sculpture removed according to superior instructions," "replacement authorized," without further explanation, without recorded debate, without attached technical justification. For large-scale public works, this is unusual. Normally, there is discussion, opposition, opinion, proposed alternative. Here, often there is just the order and its execution. In some cases, photographs from different decades reveal physical changes to the sculpture itself. Objects in the hands have been altered. Elements of the pedestal have disappeared. Inscriptions have become shorter. This points to something even more specific: recarving, later sculptural reworking, and rededication. Recarving is expensive, it's hard work, it requires a specialized professional. Nobody does it purely for aesthetic reasons. When a sculpture is reworked, there's usually a strong reason: serious structural damage or a change in meaning deemed necessary. In some records, it's indicated that the monument was adapted or updated. But updated for what exactly? In many of these cases, the end result is a more generic identification than before. Rededication adds another curious pattern. The monument remains in the same place, but the text changes. The narrative changes. The honoree ceases to be an individual and becomes a category. It's a subtle yet profound transition, from personal memory to abstract symbol, from the researchable to the irrefutable. Because you can research a person, but you cannot research a concept. The replaced plaques are a separate issue. Conservation experts note differences in material, typography, and method of attachment between the pedestal and the inscription. Modern screws on old bases, fonts incompatible with the period of the sculpture, metal alloys different from the rest of the ensemble. In some cases, fitting marks indicate that a larger plaque was removed and a smaller one was put in place. This suggests further intervention, not just the wear and tear of time. When you put these signs together, missing minutes, absent justifications, removal orders without explanation, sculptural rework, rededications, and replaced plaques, a possibility begins to emerge that institutional historians rarely like to discuss openly: deliberate reinterpretation over time. Not necessarily a single centralized operation, but a sequence of administrative, cultural, or political decisions that gradually altered the original meaning of these monuments. Instead of destroying everything, in many cases the choice was made to reinterpret, to rename, to generalize, to make symbolic what was once specific. This strategy is more effective than deleting it entirely. Destroying draws attention, reinterpreting neutralizes it. A statue being removed raises a question. A reclassified statue generates indifference. As generations pass, the new interpretation becomes the official one. The old one, lacking central documents to support it, loses strength. The monument remains standing but disconnected from its human origin. Physical presence, identity dissolved. The internal hook that underpins this stage of the investigation is simple and powerful. What disappears in these archives is not random. It is always identity. And when different cities in different regions present the same type of selective absence linked to the same type of monument, the hypothesis of mere archival accident begins to become statistically too weak to end the discussion. At this point, the mystery is no longer just about the stone or the bronze. It's about the paper that didn't survive, or perhaps shouldn't have survived. After observing the pattern of nameless statues, generic inscriptions, historically accurate clothing, detailed technical tools, and selective documentary gaps, an inevitable question arises. If we are not dealing with mere allegories, then who are we looking at? What kind of figure is preserved in image but disconnected from its own identity? This is where the investigative hypothesis linked to what many today call Tartary comes in, not as a closed conclusion, but as a possible line of investigation. The proposal is not to affirm, but to test coherence. What if some of these sculptures represent builders, engineers, cartographers, and technicians linked to a network of knowledge and infrastructure that was later reclassified, absorbed by other narratives, or simply forgotten? Observe the most frequently recurring types: architect, engineer, navigator, cartographer, technical scholar. They are not military heroes. They are not politicians. They are not wealthy patrons. They are almost always professionals linked to construction, measurement, mapping, calculation, and design. Professions that leave a physical mark on the territory: bridges, buildings, urban layouts, hydraulic systems, maps, observatories. Professions that connect applied knowledge with the concrete transformation of space. That in itself is already a curious excerpt. If these figures were merely abstract symbols of civic virtue, we would expect greater variety: justice, courage, freedom, fertility, nation, victory. But what frequently appears is the technician, the builder, the measurer of the world, as if the focus were less on values and more on infrastructure and practical knowledge. The Tartary hypothesis, within this investigative context, suggests that there may have existed a broad network of architectural and technical production attributed today to different origins, different schools, and different periods, but that it may have been more interconnected than current records indicate. If part of this network was reinterpreted over time, individual names associated with works and systems could have become inconvenient for new historical narratives organized later. This leads to three central questions that serve as the axis of tension in the episode. First, why preserve the image and erase the name? If the intention were to completely eliminate the memory, destroying the statue would be simpler. But in many cases, the image remains, the face remains, the function represented remains. What disappears is the searchable identification. This creates a paradoxical situation. The memory remains visible, but untraceable. It is a memory without a biography, presence without a curriculum, recognition without reference. Second question, what did these people build? If they were merely symbols, there is no work to trace. But if they were real individuals, then there were projects, maps, structures, calculations, methods. Some monuments appear near architectural works whose authorship is considered uncertain, collective, or administrative. In certain cases, cities with these monuments exhibit technically advanced constructions for the officially attributed period: water systems, monumental foundations, sophisticated urban layouts with surprisingly weak documentation of authorship. This doesn't prove a connection, but it creates a legitimate field for investigation. Third question, what would change if they were identified? History works by attribution. When you know who did it, you can connect schools, methods, influences, and technical lineages. If several of these names reappeared linked to multiple regions, multiple projects, and multiple works currently treated as disconnected, this could redraw maps of the diffusion of technical knowledge. It could shorten distances between centers of innovation. Note that the hypothesis doesn't require a completely erased secret civilization. It can function on a smaller scale, as a technical tradition, a network of builders, a trans-regional engineering school that was subsequently fragmented into separate national narratives. The central point is not the Tartary label itself, it is the possibility of historical reclassification of authorship and network. Another aspect that strengthens this hypothesis as a line of investigation is the temporal concentration. Many of these anonymous monuments appear in a few decades and then practically cease to exist. This suggests a phase of memory transition, a period in which there was still enough remembrance to justify homage, but there was already enough restriction to avoid naming. A short window between remembering too much to ignore and forgetting enough to not need explaining. The result is a very specific type of historical artifact, a preserved monument without identification. This is rare, and when something rare repeats in multiple places, it deserves serious investigation, not automatic dismissal. The internal hook that closes this stage is the synthesis of the paradox: preserved memory, removed identity. The stone remains, the face remains, the profession remains, the name does not. And when names selectively disappear around technical figures linked to construction and mapping, raising hypotheses about historical reclassification ceases to be empty speculation and becomes a valid methodological question. This is not a conclusion, it is an invitation to further investigation, and sometimes in historical research, a well-formulated question is worth more than a hasty answer. If you piece together all the layers, the statues with generic titles, the international standard of renaming, the technical details that don't match the allegory, the selective documentary gaps, and the later alterations, the picture that emerges is not one of conclusive proof, but neither is it a simple coincidence. It is one of legitimate historical tension. There is a set of signs pointing to an incompletely preserved memory, as if the image could remain public, but the identity could not remain traceable. It is the Tartary hypothesis within this scenario, functions as an investigative lens, not as a final verdict. It offers a model for testing connections between builders, engineers, and cartographers represented in these sculptures and possible technical networks currently fragmented in official narratives. It may result in rediscovered conventional explanations. It may reveal deeper processes of historical reclassification. In serious research, both possibilities are valid, as long as the question remains open. The central point is not to prove a theory in a single leap, it is to recognize that there are sufficient patterns to justify continued investigation. Expensive monuments without names, peripheral records intact, and identities absent. Individualized portraits treated as generic symbols, replaced plaques, reduced inscriptions, silent rededications. When the same type of erasure always falls on the same type of information, authorship, it ceases to be a detail and becomes an object of study. Perhaps some of these sculptures are indeed misinterpreted allegories. Perhaps others